My topic today is the sixth assessment of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm Peter Carter. I'm director of the Climate Emergency Institute. The last of the three sections of the sixth assessment was published earlier this month in April 2022. So I've been studying this working group 3, it is, mitigation report, and found that I really had to present them and put them all together. I've selected some extracts from each, and I'm hoping I can get across how important this climate change assessment is to our future. It's a question that the IPCC actually recognized of whether we have a future or not. The IPCC Working Group 1, Science, and Working Group 2, Impacts, made the Working Group 3, Mitigation, imperative of an immediate, rapid global emissions decline, essential for a livable future. And for the first time, the IPCC, in 2 of these reports, commented on a livable future. The Working Group 3 repeated over and over, as has the chair of the IPCC, Hossein Lee, at the last big United Nations climate conference, as he stated at the opening of the conference. So this Working Group 3 mitigation made it very clear that emissions, global emissions, have to be put into decline on an immediate basis. But although since that 2018 report, the world generally realizes that we are in a climate emergency and it's getting more and more dire by the year, the governments and the corporations, fossil fuel corporations, and the banking corporations, either they have no idea of what an emergency response is, or to be more accurate, they are obstructing any emergency response. And so today, there is no emergency response to this dire climate change situation. Here I'm putting in a chart that I put together on what an emergency response is. And these are the numbers. These are the required reductions in emissions by Working Group 3 for mitigation. It's the SPM, so it's been agreed to, the numbers have been agreed to by all of the scientists and all of the world governments. And this assumes immediate action. And here I've got for 1.5 degrees C, and here I've got for 2 degrees C. And in addition to carbon dioxide required global reductions, the AR6 in the mitigation report added methane, because it is also essential to reduce methane by a required amount in order to stabilize the global climate. I'll leave you with this to refer to at your leisure, so to speak. And there's another factor which I've had to bring in, because it's a tragic but very powerful factor with respect to our abilities to mitigate climate change. As global emissions keep rising as fast as ever, there is no international cooperation to address this climate and oceans' most dire emergency. So if this wasn't bad enough, now we have a war. The war in Ukraine makes such cooperation, as we can clearly see, impossible. It relegates climate change mitigation to the back burner, and it elevates the status of fossil fuel energy for national security. Forgotten is the fact that a stable climate and oceans and relative absence of extreme weather events, the fact that this totally depends on the security of all of us, national and international, has been forgotten about in an instant. And it's not surprising of this terrible, terrible conflict which is going on in Ukraine. And so today we find ourselves, in the words of the United Nations Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, in her opening of the Glasgow October 2021 United Nations COP26, the last big climate conference, in which she said, and now we're facing this as a most tragic, terrible reality. She says humanity faces a bleak future on this planet if we don't have an immediate emergency response, as was expected to come out of the Glasgow conference, and which did not. And, she said, we are investing in our own extinction. So, the war effect. Peace is for sure now essential for climate change mitigation and essential for our survival country. As a result, of course, of what's happening, and things have happened so fast, governments are ramping up their militarization and their armaments like never before. And the world has entered a new Cold War. And again, it's between the Russian Federation and the United States NATO, basically. However, it's worse than that, because now we have two armed camps bristling with the most terrible nuclear still and awful high-tech weapons of all kinds. I hear there's no end in sight for what's happening in the Ukraine. The United States military says this could go on for years. And from the last Cold War, this Cold War will go on for years. So the result of this, very suddenly, is that it drops climate change as a policy priority. It drops climate change from a media priority. And as has always been the case, I think, defense has become, first and foremost, the overriding concern and policy of all countries. Now, mitigation, of course, of climate change requires the highest level of cooperation amongst nations. That's why we've had United Nations negotiating climate conferences for 25 years, and why we have made no progress whatsoever. Because we just haven't been able to develop the international cooperation necessary. It's stayed in economic, national self-interest more than a global unity of purpose to respond effectively to the climate emergency. So, as I say again, there is no response to the climate emergency. So we need this highest level of cooperation. It's not happened in the past, and under this situation it simply cannot. Now then, there's the other aspect of such a conflict. Manufacturing and operating heavy war machines is fossil fuel dependent and fossil fuel intensive. And a lot of these heavy war machines are being destroyed in the Ukraine, and countries will be manufacturing more of them to replace those and stronger ones and more effective in the killing field ones than ever before. That's what will be going on. So a rapid, if any, phase out of fossil fuel energy has not happened. Emissions are going up faster than ever, and now it won't for the foreseeable future. This would lead to the question of carbon dioxide removal of carbon dioxide from the air, and there was a lot of content on carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and sequestration, CCS as it's called, in the IPCC Working Group 3 mitigation report. For the possibility, perhaps, of being able to remove CO2 out of the atmosphere, we need a massive research and development project. Massive. Huge amounts of money, financing, and resources poured into this project. It hasn't happened up to now. The IPCC, I checked this, the IPCC actually did a special report on carbon capture and storage back in 2005. So this has been on the radar forever, but there's nothing happening. And it won't happen without a massive amount of financing, and it won't happen without making climate change mitigation a priority for all nations, all countries, internationally, and in all our plans that we have for our civilization and how we're going to develop. The situation which we're in as regards policies and priorities now is that governments and the banks will continue to support and finance the constantly increasing combustion and therefore emissions of fossil fuels. They have been doing this no matter all the IPCC assessments, the big scientific assessments, that hasn't made any difference to the governments and the banks. They are investing in our own extinction faster than ever before. This situation that we're in, the globally catastrophic increase of 2 degrees C will be exceeded by 2050. The 2021 energy-related carbon dioxide emissions were at a record high. This is from the International Energy Agency, and a record one-year increase. So while we were in this dire climate emergency, oceans emergency, because of ocean acidification from CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels, the governments and the investors and the banks pushed more and more and more fossil fuel extraction and combustion, so that when the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, had this much publicized, really sharp, sudden reduction in CO2 emissions, what happened was the governments and financing corporations just turned around and put it right back up again. Which is probably the most evil thing I've ever seen done in my life. And I say that because the advice was universal to governments not to do this, but for governments to put the economic renewal, recovery, that of course they were bound to do, but to put all that money into zero carbon combustion, clean, non-polluting, renewable, everlasting energy. They did not. They put substantially more of the financing into the planet and future-killing fossil fuel industry. Then we have, which was covered in Working Group 3, we have national emissions targets. The governments decide on an emissions target for 10 years, 20 years, and then they file this with the United Nations Climate Secretariat, and these are now called NDCs, Nationally Determined Contributions. And all that means is that they're voluntary now. There's actually no commitment. So what we found was that even if governments applied, and they're actually not, applied United Nations national emissions targets, we find that at best, global emissions will not decrease by 2030. But even if they don't increase, they're at such an unprecedentedly high level that drives the acceleration of cumulative carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because carbon dioxide lasts so long, lasts practically forever, that if you're emitting any of it, it builds up in the atmosphere. So I want to make this clear, because if the global emissions don't continue to increase, okay, if they just remain on a plateau, that's game over for our planet, because it's a massive, massive amount of carbon dioxide which is then being poured into the atmosphere constantly. So there's what I'm giving you, I'm afraid, is reasons, and the many of them, why we certainly will not limit to 1.5 degrees C, and why we will not limit to 2 degrees C. And one of them is the national emissions targets, which are, in the words of one climate scientist, paltry, why they're not going to go down, which means that carbon dioxide is going to continue to shoot up. But the other one I've already mentioned, but I want to mention it specifically now. The United Nations last year, 2021 Glasgow conference, the UK being one of the best, still far from good enough, but one of the best with regards to attention to climate change, the UK did actually try. It proposed what could have been an agreement, at least, to do something. But because there was no cooperation amongst the nations there, it didn't happen. So specifically, there was not an agreement, as was suggested, on phasing out coal. So that's not going to happen. In fact, this year, we're burning more coal than ever before. Coal combustion is at a peak. And they did not agree on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, which is just unbelievable. Total world fossil fuel subsidies are running at almost $6 trillion a year. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund no less, published an update of their assessment of total fossil fuel subsidies, total economic benefits given by our government, which basically is given by us taxpayers, to the fossil fuel industry to continue to destroy our future. It was $5.9 trillion per year. Trillions and trillions of dollars a year. And the IMF estimates that they're going to continue to go up. They're at 6.8% of global domestic product, and the IMF foresees, and they should know, that they're going to go up to 7.5% by 2025. So according to the IMF projections, in 2025, at which time our global emissions should be declining fast, the governments will be putting more subsidies into the fossil fuel industry, making emissions continue to go up as fast as ever, if not faster. So here's another reason then, which I've alluded to, but I want to give you the details on why we're going to go over the catastrophic 2 degrees C. And that is that this post-recovery, economic recovery that I referred to, that I said was mainly fossil fuels, it was $371 billion. 40% of all the economic recovery in energy was put into fossil fuels. A massive, massive all-time amount of financing by our governments. And the banks have been putting in trillions as well. In the past 5 years, the banks have been financing the fossil fuel industry to the tune also of several $trillions. So just imagine this, trillions and trillions of dollars are being poured into the fossil fuel industry to frack and dig up more fossil fuels so that we are going to remain dependent, dominated by this fossil fuel economy, which is a dead end. I mean, a real dead end. And the other thing, reason why we're going to go over 2 degrees C, is that atmospheric greenhouse gas levels, that's carbon dioxide, that includes methane, it includes nitrous oxide, they are still increasing, and they are increasing at an accelerating rate. And that was in the working group science report of this 6th assessment. And then we've got a new one, which is really scary. This was in the IPCC Working Group 1 assessment as well, and it was in the Global Carbon Project, their annual report in 2021. Our carbon sinks are losing efficiency. This was not supposed to happen until the end of this century. But already, I want to make a point of this because it didn't get publicized, the land, the forest, carbon sink have started to sink less of our emissions, and that will continue. And also the oceans that sink a lot of our carbon dioxide emissions, that efficiency has started to decline. So you see all these things, scientific facts, policy absence, investment by governments, investment by banks, state of war and international conflict. We're going to go well over 2 degrees C. Now, I mentioned that emissions are going up as fast as ever. They're actually going up faster than ever. The IPCC Working Group 3, the one that was recently out, had this statistic. Between 2010 and 2019, global greenhouse gas emissions and global CO2 emissions increased by 12%. When we have this huge mega amount of emissions going out every year, 12% in a decade is huge. It's a huge rate of increase. Working Group 3 told the world what the world had to do to avoid global climate catastrophe, assuming immediate action. See, I said immediate and immediate and immediate. It was in this report. For limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, and that's just a more than a 50% chance of limiting to 1.5 degrees C, carbon dioxide emissions have to be reduced 48% by 2030. Now, the media, they were good. They did cotton onto this because I read that our emissions of carbon dioxide have to be cut 50% by 2030. And Working Group 3 said they had to be cut 80% by 2040. And in addition, and this is a new one for the IPCC, global methane emissions have to be reduced 34% by a third in 2030, within 10 years, and 44% in 2040, or by 2040. So that's quite simply the scientific fact of what must happen if humanity and all life on this planet are to avoid a global warming, a degree of global climate change of 1.5 degrees C. And bear in mind, we are at 1.1 degrees C today. And all these unprecedented extreme weather events that were so well recorded in Working Group 2 they're all happening in every region of the planet, of every kind of extreme weather events, including forest fires and including droughts. They're all happening like they've never happened before. And of course, a similar situation applies to 2 degrees C. So we're certainly going to go over 1.5 degrees C. And I'll explain from the assessments how we're going to be there in less than a decade. We're going to be at 1.5 degrees C by 2030 or around 2030. So 2 degrees C, which has always for decades been regarded as the catastrophically dangerous limit to global warming. That goes back to the 90s. For a limit of 2 degrees C, oh, and this is only by 2100. So warming will go on after 2100. So it's not a total limit. But for 2 degrees C by 2100, global carbon dioxide emissions have to be reduced 27% by 2030 and 52% by 2040. That is a lot. That's a very, very large cut in emissions for 2 degrees C, which is catastrophe. And in addition, the IPCC here again included methane emissions. And methane for 2 degrees C has to be reduced 24% in 2030 and 37% in 2040. So even for 2 degrees C, in order to be able to survive, let alone have a life worth living, let alone prosper, we have to have global emissions into decline immediately and sharply and rapidly, even for 2 degrees C. The big question today, big question for all time comes to that, is when will 1.5 degrees C of warming be reached, and when will 2 degrees C be reached? The IPCC assessments tell us that 1.5 degrees C will be reached around 2030. In other words, we'll be at 1.5 degrees C within 10 years, and for 2 degrees C, that will be reached by 2050. 1.5 degrees C today is absolutely unavoidable, and 2 degrees C is practically unavoidable. Despite the fact that we cannot avoid 1.5 degrees C and that it is globally disastrous, from the 1.5 degrees C report in particular, nothing is being done to prepare for this globally disastrous level of 1.5 degrees C of warming. And nothing is being done to avoid the planetary catastrophic 2 degrees C. Again, worse than nothing, because fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emissions are being pushed and pushed higher. The IPCC sixth assessment gives us the time when 1.5 degrees C will be reached, and AR6 states that it will be reached in the early 2030s. This from Working Group 1, 2 quotes, same thing. The central estimate of crossing the 1.5 degrees C global warming level lies in the early 2030s. We had that knowledge actually provided for us in 2018 by the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report. What you're seeing is that familiar global average temperature increase record, and this is projected by the computer model up to 2050. And 1.5 degrees C is reached, to be precise here, 2033, and 2 degrees C is reached by 2045. And this projection was assuming the continuation of high fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emissions. This is what I've chosen to use to show the 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C projection from the sixth assessment. This is also from Working Group 1, in fact. We see that 1.5 degrees C will be reached, to be precise here, 2032. And using this scenario here, we can predict that 2 degrees C will be reached by 2050. It's more than sad. One of the infuriating things for me is that we've known about all this for so long. The IPCC have done their job in documenting this for many, many years. There's a chart that I used a lot in my science conference presentations, which goes back again to the fourth assessment in 2007. And the chart had all the impacts that the IPCC projected would happen at 1.5, 2, 3, 4 degrees. And they had water, they had ecosystems, they had food, they had coastal regions, they had health, and extreme weather events. And they all kicked in seriously at 1.5 degrees C. Back in 2007. And very, very seriously, potentially to a catastrophic degree at 2 degrees C. And all of these many, many, many impacts on the human population, on human security, reported by the IPCC in its fourth assessment. But we're now up to the assessment this year, the sixth assessment, and in actual fact, the science has improved in a sense. They have more data, they got better models, and it's all going to happen earlier than that. And they do this, they started doing this in 2001, and it's a clever way of doing it. And they have what they call reasons for concern, which came to be known as the burning embers. And they have columns of different impacts. And quite simply, they go from white to yellow to orange to red to bright red. And then they correlate that with the global warming, the global temperature increase. And those at 1.5 degrees C are really, really bad, really bad. One aspect of the predicament that we're in is that today we must assume, because all the evidence is, that nothing's going to happen between now and 2025 and after 2025. That means that we will have committed ourselves to this absolute planetary catastrophic 3.2 degrees C. However, it's going to be more than 3.2 degrees C. And there's two reasons for that. And the reasons are both not accounted for in the IPCC scientific projections. And that is really bad. I mean, the IPCC is so important because it does document all this for us. But it really, really falls down, and I don't know why they're still doing it. They omit, number one, they omit all the amplifying feedbacks. And it's all sort of always been known that when we heat up the surface of the planet, we result in changes to that planet, which causes more CO2 to be emitted. So we've sort of always known that global temperature increases global warming. And the more we allow the temperature to increase, the more of those emissions we're going to get out. The well-known one is the thawing of the permafrost, which as it thaws, and it is doing, emits methane. It also emits CO2, and it also emits nitrous oxide. But the forests do it, the soils do it, the wetlands do it. So there's huge sources of these carbon feedbacks or greenhouse gas feedback emissions around the planet. And I did find that in this working group 3, in working group 2 report, I did find there was a reference to the fact, which I'd been aware of for quite a long time, but it was good to see confirmation by the IPCC, that when we get to 2 degrees C, these carbon feedbacks will be operating in a significant manner. So 2 degrees C, we start increasing all our predictions of more warming after that. So by 3.2 degrees C, there'll be a lot of extra greenhouse gases and extra warming on top of the 3.2 degrees C. And I do not understand why the IPCC does not account for that. The other thing, of course, why these temperature increases are going to be worse is that the carbon sinks have started to lose their efficiency. So from now on, the forests and the oceans will still be drawing down, taking down carbon, but they'll be doing it progressively less and less and less and less. And so more and more and more and more CO2 will be left up in the atmosphere. So though we are emitting CO2 at an enormous, rapid amount, as bad as ever, and although, of course, that's resulting in atmospheric CO2 concentration accelerating, that acceleration is going to increase. And global surface warming is also accelerating, and that will increase at 2 degrees C and above. These are things to be very, very scared of. They're the facts. They're the definite science. They've been confirmed by the IPCC, which means all the scientists in the world. It also means actually all the governments in the world, because the IPCC is this odd organization that allows government bureaucrats, policymakers on the panel involved in the publication of their assessments as well as the scientists. So everybody agrees on the facts that I'm presenting here, and they are terrifying. Terrifying. I want to scare you. I want to scare you into mobilization. I want to scare you into hammering on the doors of your governments. I want to scare you into joining Extinction Rebellion and making a lot of noise and a lot of fuss outside these big global banks and the government departments. I want to scare you to do all that. I'm doing my best, but I'm sort of a little bit old for that. But nevertheless. So back to global emissions. So in Working Group 3, there was a good record, and it was broken down by kinds of greenhouse gas emissions, the countries they come from. But the big point is that global emissions are increasing as fast as ever, and actually in the past few years faster than ever. The Working Group 3 said that global emissions have increased 50% since 1990. 1990 is no time ago. In the last decade, from 2010 to 2019, they increased 12%. And for the past 4 years, the rate of emissions is the highest that they've been going back to 2000, when they started to kick up very rapidly. So we're emitting CO2 and greenhouse gases faster than we've emitted them before. And this is absolutely certain, as Patricia Espinosa said at the opening of COP26, this is absolutely certain an investment into our own extinction. There was an odd, surprising thing that I noticed in Working Group 3. Every one of the scenarios assumed that the world economy would increase. Every scenario assumed continued economic growth. And of course, a lot of people have pointed out for decades that the primary reason, the root cause that we're doing all this damage to the planet is that we have exponential economic growth, that our manufacturing production every year is increasing. The record shown in these graphs is most important. This demonstrates the world economy and the link to CO2 emissions and global climate change and global temperature. The first one here shows global CO2 emissions in green, blue global domestic product, the world economy, and dashed brown is energy. And energy is at present 85% fossil fuel energy. So all of these match closely. This shows global CO2 emissions and GDP, and this is from a research paper of 2014 showing a record from 1990 projected to 2020, and global GDP matches closely global CO2 emissions. This paper stated that global emissions of CO2 from fossil fuel combustion were growing at 2.5% per year over the past decade, and they also showed that CO2 emissions were tracking at the high end of the emissions scenarios, in other words, the worst case scenario. This one here shows GDP in per capita dollars. These graphs are from 1900 to 2020. This is cumulative CO2 emissions, which we've already seen. And then this one here is global average temperature increase. And so it's clear that increasing GDP, cumulative CO2 emissions, and global temperature match closely. So we're in the very worst situation that we could possibly be for mitigating climate change and responding to the climate emergency, and ensuring that we have a chance of future survival. So in Working Group 3, I found that all of the greenhouse gases, every single one of them, is increasing at a rapid rate. CO2 is, industry and fossil fuel CO2 is, CO2 from deforestation is increasing at a rapid rate. Methane is increasing at a rapid rate. The scientists are all over that. They're trying to figure out why. That's very, very worrying, because methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide, that's increasing at a rapid rate. The global warming gases that are increasing at by far the fastest rate are the ones that are called halocarbons, or F gases. Now, they're man-made, they're manufactured gases that are used in various industries. But there are alternatives. They don't have to be used, but they've been produced by big corporations. Now, although they're emitted in tiny amounts, they are by far the most potent greenhouse gas that there is, and by far the longest lasting greenhouse gas there is. These are potent global heating greenhouse gases, and they are increasing faster than any of the others. So another reason why we're going to go past 2 degrees C before 2050. This is inferred in Working Group 3, but it relates to the projection of energy over the next few decades, energy production by 2050. And of course, I watch this year after year, always have done. The best source, IEA that I mentioned, is a good source, but actually the really most reliable source is the U.S. Energy Information. It's called the EIA, and they do a regular monthly assessment of what's happening and going to happen with energy in the United States, and they do an international one once a year. So they say that by 2050, fossil fuel energy will have increased greatly, and although today fossil fuel energy is 85% of world energy, and our wonderful renewable energies are 15%, come 2050, fossil fuel energy will still be 75% and renewables 25%. Now, understandably, generally people focus on the renewable energy because it is a wonderful achievement and it's a great story. But unfortunately, it really means nothing unless we are displacing and replacing fossil fuel energy with renewable energy. And because of the world economy, and because of the banks, and because of the government subsidies, that's simply not happening. So in several decades, by 2050, and this US EIA is very reliable, it won't be much better. And that's, when I look at this graph of all these fossil fuel energies going up from now until 2050, what I see is the end of the world. That's what I see. It's an end of the world projection. So Working Group 1, that was published and the media got their headline, which was, and this is the science, climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. Climate change, widespread, rapid, intensifying. Getting worse, worse, worse. And as a result of that simple statement, that finding, a livable future is being lost. As we're burning more fossil fuels, we're losing more future. I've said for many years, as we burn more fossil fuels, we're burning food for the future. We're burning our children's food. Climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. So the IPCC, the scientists, have predicted the terrible situation that we're in for many, many, many years. They say from Working Group 1 that further warming will amplify the thawing of the permafrost and the loss of the spring, winter-spring seasonal snow cover. It will amplify the rate of melting of glaciers and ice sheets and the loss of Arctic summer sea ice. So when we're losing summer sea ice in the Arctic, that's driving up the heating in the Arctic and increasingly driving up the heating of the planet. The Arctic is now, it was a couple of years ago, warming at double the rate of the global average temperature, which was alarming, but it's now increased to its 3 times the rate of the average global warming. And that is increasing the thaw rate of the permafrost. And the permafrost holds double all the carbon in the atmosphere. Changes to the ocean, including ocean heating, more frequent marine heat waves, ocean acidification, and reduced oxygen level have been clearly linked to our emissions. So we have, all of these are accelerating. Ocean heating is accelerating. Marine heat waves are accelerating, they've doubled. Ocean acidification is accelerating. And deoxygenation of the ocean is also accelerating. Even, Working Group 1 science, even with strong and sustained reductions in emissions, it'll take 20 to 30 years to see the global temperature stabilize. Just underlines the fact that this has to be immediate, has to be now. Now, Working Group 2, the impacts. A few aspects of Working Group 2. Well, this was a really good report. I mean, it was terrible to read, but it's a really good report. And that shows that a livable future is being lost rapidly. Human-induced climate change is causing dangerous and widespread destruction in nature, and it is already affecting billions of people around the world. Billions. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. The health of the planet means a planet which will sustain the human race. That's what a healthy planet means. Any further delay in concerted, that cooperative, global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. That is quite some sentence from the IPCC. Hossan Lee, whom I referred to already, the IPCC chair, here's what he said for Working Group 2. This report is a dire warning about the consequences of inaction. You couldn't be more definite than these statements from the IPCC. Increased heat waves, droughts, and floods are already exceeding the plants and animals' tolerance threshold, driving mass mortalities in species, including trees and coral reefs. Mass mortalities. We're killing the planet. No, we're not doing it. Governments, banks, corporations, they're doing it. But we've got to get on their back. Extreme weather events are now common, we know that, but they're now occurring simultaneously, and they're now causing cascading extreme weather event impacts. And they've exposed millions more people. We've got a lot of people hungry, and it's increasing now because of climate change and conflict. But these weather extremes are exposing millions more people to acute food and water insecurity. People's health, lives and livelihoods, as well as their property and critical infrastructure, including energy and transportation systems, they're being increasingly adversely affected by frequent hazards of heat waves, storms, droughts, and floodings. And don't we know this? The Working Group 2 report emphasizes the extreme urgency of immediate, more ambitious action. That's another quote. And the last quote from Working Group 2 I've got, safeguarding and strengthening nature is key to, again, securing a livable future. So you see how the IPCC is messaging us? It's a livable future that's at stake now. And of course, we've got this damn horrible war going on, in the middle of Europe. And so I come to Working Group 3. That's the report that's recently been published. And what Working Group 3 says is immediate global emissions reductions are necessary for a livable future. The quote, we are at a crossroads. The decisions we make now can secure a livable future. And obviously the message is if we don't have a livable future. The evidence is clear. The time for action is now, and this is important. We can halve emissions by 2030. So what the IPCC Working Group 3, of course, is saying is we can and we have to, if we want to have a future, halve emissions by 2030. And we've known for years and years and years that that's totally doable. What's been obstructing it is our damn governments subsidizing fossil fuels and not putting a price on carbon, not charging the fossil fuel corporations the full cost of their deadly, future-killing fossil fuels. Oh, and I should mention, it's not in the report, because the report doesn't do air pollution, it just does climate. But I should mention, again, I mentioned it before, the latest research is that fossil fuel air pollution, fossil fuel specifically, is now killing over 10 million people a year. So how can our governments and corporations, continue to promote, finance, and drive more extraction of more fossil fuels for more burning of more fossil fuels, 10 million people dying year after year after year? That's a monumental evil, a monumental evil. Again, it says, without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C is beyond reach, and it is beyond reach. I was glad to see in Working Group 3 this statement. International cooperation is a critical enabler for achieving what we have to achieve, which they call ambitious climate change mitigation. And then there's this quote. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable and sustainable future for us all. We have no years left. No years left. They mention that terminating, actually stopping fossil fuel subsidies would help. They also mention the quote is removing fossil fuel subsidies would help. You want to believe it would help. And carbon pricing would help. They mention something here in Working Group 3. They say that scaling up mitigation in developing countries by improving or starting finance flows from developed to developing contexts countries in the context of $100 billion a year goal would help. This has received a fair bit of publicity. At least 10 years ago, the industrially developed countries agreed under the United Nations climate negotiations that by 2020, they would be donating $100 billion a year to the developing countries to help them developing clean energy and to help them adapt and cope with climate change, which of course impacts more severely on the developing regions. And again, they talked about it at the Glasgow COP26 last year. They didn't do it. So they renege year after year after year on this desperate need and promise that they gave them, right? So we have the opposite of cooperation when it comes to these big economy countries. So Working Group 3 had a graph which is very familiar. It's a graph that's been put out by Scientific Research and UNEP and others. And the media picked this up from Working Group 3 as what they call it's now or never. And this is a graph of global greenhouse gas emissions from 2010 to 2050 and how those emissions have to change if we're going to have a livable future. If we're going to limit to 2 degrees C, because remember 1.5 degrees C is going to hit us in 2030 and it's going to be awful. And for 2 degrees C, the graph makes it very clear that emissions have to decline by 2020. So all of these similar graphs that are in the Working Group 3 report, all the emissions from mitigation declined from 2020, 2 years ago. So we not only have no more years left, we put the future at a severe disadvantage. There was another graph in Working Group 3 which projected and showed what delaying global emissions past 2025 would do and how it would commit us to a catastrophic warming of 3.2 degrees C this century. And that graph was very useful for me because it confirmed that 1.5 degrees C is going to be 2030. That 2 degrees C is, specifically according to this graph, at 2047 before 2050. And this 3 degrees C or more is going to be 2080. Now that 3 degrees C will be earlier than 2080 because of the feedbacks pushing out more emissions and because of the carbon sinks failing more and more. The worst of all impacts of global warming, which we've known for decades would happen, is the failure of the carbon sinks. That is the single worst thing that could happen. And the reason for that is that the carbon sinks, the forests and the oceans have been buffering, taking up about 50% of our emissions. So they've been taking up a huge amount of our emissions. Even so, atmospheric greenhouse gases are accelerating, even though that's been happening. But now that efficiency has started to decline, and it will decline further. The IPCC assessments have put various dates on this. In the last assessment, the AR5 in 2014, they said this won't happen until the end of the century at the earliest. But even their best computer models are not very good at handling this kind of complicated projection. I mentioned the impacts at 1.5 and 2 degrees C, and I mentioned that how we know how bad, terribly bad they would be. We knew that from the 2007 fourth assessment. The 2018 IPCC 1.5 degrees C report was a superb report. This is the one that woke the world up, and people suddenly realized, yes, we're in a global climate emergency. So they have a very, very good chart which I call tens, hundreds, and thousands of millions of people being impacted, and they do 1.5 degrees C, and then they do 2 degrees C. And that's why I've been saying for years, since this report came out, that there's no question that 1.5 degrees C is a disastrous world. No question. I mean, it's disastrous already, let's face it. But 2 degrees C is way, way worse than 1.5 degrees C. Before they did this report, the scientists thought, and they said that they didn't think there'd be a huge amount of difference between warming up to 2 degrees C compared to 1.5 degrees C, but there's a massive difference. I mentioned the burning embers, and at 1.5 degrees C, we're way into the red for the most vulnerable populations and ecosystems. We are just into the red on extreme weather events at 1.5. Then they have one called, they call it large-scale singular events. These are massive changes to the planet, like the Greenland ice sheet going irreversibly, like the Antarctic ice sheet going irreversibly, like multiple carbon feedbacks being poured out from the Arctic and the subarctic. The other way these are referred to are as tipping points. So these planetary catastrophic tipping points, at 1.5 degrees C, we're into the red. And then it goes higher, of course, at 2 degrees C. I'm going to refer to that one that I said I was happy to find, because it confirmed that we would have carbon feedbacks operating by global warming of 2 degrees C. So tree mortality, we are getting increasing tree mortality already at 1 degree C. And it just gets higher. We just lose more trees, more forest dieback, and that means that the carbon absorbing capacity of the trees is going down. Wildfire increase, well, we know that's increasing. It becomes significant at 1.5 degrees C. I mean, it's significant for people where they live on the unprecedented wildfires, but on a global basis at 1.5 degrees C, they're really, really bad. And so that's why they have carbon loss occurring at 1.5 degrees C and becoming significant at 2 degrees C. Now, they also have biodiversity loss in these burning embers in this section, and they also have coral reefs. We're in the 6th mass extinction of life on the planet, and climate change adds to that rate of extinction. The 6th mass extinction is accelerating. Life is disappearing all around us. If you lived as long as I have, you certainly know that. And it's a painful experience to realize it. But biodiversity loss, species and loss of living populations, that's further accelerated now at a warming of 1 degree C. And that gets very high at 1.5 degrees C. All the scenarios, even the best case IPCC scenarios, increase the rate of species extinction. And then we come to the hardest cut of all. Coral reefs, including the Great Barrier Reef, the largest, most amazing, cooperative, organic living being on the planet is the Great Barrier Reef. And the barrier reef is formed by cooperation between aquatic species, and the coral reefs support, at various stages in their life, 25% of marine life. The 1.5 degree C report gave us the news that at 1.5 degrees C, 90% of the coral reefs will be gone. At 2 degrees C, 99% will be gone. And the reason why I'm having such a bad time with this one is the Great Barrier Reef has just gone through another major bleaching event because the water is too warm for the organism, and that shouldn't be happening because the scientists tell us we're in a La Nina phase, and that's a cooling phase. So what's happening is that every couple of years, the Great Barrier Reef is having these major catastrophic bleaching events. But the fault, where the evil comes from that's doing all this, is the governments who are hand in hand, of course, with the fossil fuel corporations. Even the supposed best of governments, hand in hand, doling out massive amounts of money to keep the fossil fuel industry polluting the atmosphere and driving up climate change and ocean acidification even faster. Fossil fuel corporations and the banks. The banks. And the banks and our governments, as I say, are giving the fossil fuel corporations trillions of dollars a year to annihilate the future. So my appeal is, number one, with this horrible situation in the Ukraine, which is ramping up militarization and weapons of mass destruction. They're all weapons of mass destruction everywhere. Wage peace all you can. Take sides if you want. Russia's obviously the aggressor, but wage peace. Make peace, help peace, pressure peace, and disarmament. We've had considerable success with nuclear disarmament in the past few decades, but there's still thousands of them around. And of course, these new weapons are just, I mean, they're high tech, but they're absolutely horrible. So we need peace. We need world, global disarmament. We need world peace, in other words. It's now a survival imperative. We have to make peace in order now to survive, not just because of nuclear annihilation, but because of driving climate change and ocean disruption, climate disruption and ocean disruption even faster. And it's such a monumental tragedy that when we absolutely least needed it, this horrible war takes place. And as people have said, puts climate change on the back burner. Hopefully I've communicated the sense that this is made a terribly bad situation terribly worse. Putin's war is looking like a war to end everything, an end of the world Holocaust situation. We have escalating war in Europe, a hot war, escalated now, world arms race, nuclear weapons, renewed Cold War, again from Putin. At the same time, we have record high CO2 emissions and a record high increase in those emissions. We have ignored accelerating climate change, with Putin's war ignored worse more than ever. And we have, of course, the climate change boosted ongoing 6 mass extinction of life. Working Group 3 now, the mitigation of climate change. So I made this statement here because this comes across so strongly in Working Group 3 as well as included in the other working groups. It is imperative for humanity and the planet that there is immediate global emissions decline for a livable future. Another statement from the chair of the IPCC, this is a dire warning about the consequences of inaction. It shows that climate change is a grave and mounting threat to humanity and the planet. That theme repeated. It says here, time for action is now, it's got to be immediate, and it says we can halve emissions by 2030. That comes from the Working Group 3 report that states we have to decrease CO2 emissions by 48% by 2030. Without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C is beyond reach. It is beyond reach, and the same statement here applies to 2 degrees C. Without immediate and deep emissions reductions, all sectors, 2 degrees C is out of reach. And the report emphasizes the urgency of immediate, ambitious action. So Working Group 3 says we are at a crossroads. Humanity, the human race, is at a crossroads today. The decisions we make now can secure a livable future. If we do not act now to mitigate climate change by putting emissions into rapid decline, we do not have a livable future. Working Group 3 repeats some of the impacts. Increased heat waves, droughts and floods are already exceeding the tolerance threshold of plants and animals. So the plants and animals have reached a degree of climate change in which they can't adapt. They are beginning to suffer the effects, as it says here, driving mass mortalities in species, including trees and coral. These weather extremes are occurring simultaneously, causing cascading impacts. Working Group 3, the world faces unavoidable, multiple climate hazards over the next 2 decades with a global warming of 1.5 degrees C. Here it states that 1.5 degrees C is unavoidable. Even temporarily exceeding this warming level will result in additional severe impacts, some of which will be irreversible. And so we are going to go over 1.5 degrees C, and the world will be hit by those even more severe impacts. People's health, lives and livelihoods are being increasingly impacted by hazards from heat waves, storms, drought and flooding, including sea level rise. And final part of the press release from Working Group 3 is something we've known forever, is so important. Climate change interacts with adverse global trends, global environmental degradations and socioeconomic deprivations, and Working Group 3 includes here unsustainable uses of natural resources, growing urbanization, social inequalities, and the losses and damages from extreme events. So we got to work very, very, very hard on this, all of us. I'll finish by giving a plug to my favorite climate change organization in the United States called the Climate Mobilization. And they're great. They've had great successes. They're doing great work. And we all have to mobilize. It's the idea of mobilization has been around for many years. Lester Brown wrote his book, Plan B4, Mobilizing to Save Civilization. And a great book it was, of solutions. We all, citizens, have to mobilize. And it simply isn't happening. And it's simply got to happen. All of us folk, people around the world, we can all communicate, right? We've got that. We all have to mobilize. We all have to mobilize for our planet. We all have to mobilize for Mother Earth or Mother Nature. And it's got to be when? Immediate. Immediate. That's the message that's coming across so strongly from Working Group 3. It's never come across as strongly as this time. So thanks for listening, and let's get to it.